Hi, Claire Bergkamp. How are you today?
Good. Very happy to be
Great.
here. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, thanks for tuning in with me. It's morning here in the Bay Area in California, and you are in London, where you're winding down your day. How are things there?
Things are fine. We're in the middle of a lockdown and that's that. That's the world we're in. But other than that, things are great.
Absolutely. Well, I think, the um, I guess, hard to kind of pick out silver linings, but in some ways, the ability to, be able to connect like this, I think is something that we're all learning and leaning into more since we're spending more times on devices and at home. Like, how do we look for personal connection? And that was the point to me reaching out to you and asking you to spend some time with me today talking a little bit about sustainability, fashion industry, purpose-driven work, all of the things that you and I are both doing and working on. So again, thanks for being here. Why don't we start out? So for those who are listening, I know we're live right now, and then some will see this later as a recording. But for those who are listening to us, you and I met about, I'm going to say it was 2014 at the Copenhagen Fashion Summit at a dinner in an attic in Copenhagen that was being hosted one evening with a whole bunch of interesting people. And we sat down next to each other. And my memory of that was just the sort of openness to the discussion that we both had around the kind of work that we were trying to do in the industry. And I responded to that. Tell me a little bit about, sort of at that time when we met, like what was going on with you?
Oh man, 2014. It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? No, but I
Yeah,
remember our meeting very well. That was a lovely, intimate dinner setting in a beautiful apartment loft in Copenhagen.
right.
And it feels like a lifetime ago in a lot of ways because, I think we've moved on a lot in the work you and I are both individually doing.
That's right.
And I think we've seen a huge amount of change and shift in that amount of time in the conversation. I feel like in 2014 it wasn't, I wouldn't call it fringe. I mean, we were there, we were at a big event, but
Hmm.
it certainly wasn't as center stage as it is now.
Absolutely. And I think, it's right. Like you were the global director of sustainability for Stella McCartney. I think then I was running the Fashion Positive initiative, but not yet the president of Cradle to Cradle, but soon after became that. And since then, you and I both moved on to other things, and you're now the COO at Textile Exchange, which is amazing. And we want to talk about that. But to comment on what you were just saying, like, I absolutely think there is a pretty huge shift that's happening right now. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, like, what is happening in the sustainable apparel movement. Am I just in a bubble because all my news feeds are popping the stuff up all the time and it looks like that's all anybody's talking about besides the pandemic and politics? But yeah, like, what do you see right now, and what's different?
I think we are in a bubble. I think we should acknowledge that, first of all.
Right.
I think that simultaneously it's very easy to be in our bubble, because we have such an incredible community. And I think that's one of the really special things about the sustainability movement within the fashion industry is that we have this wonderful community. I know you're going to be having a lot of our mutually great friends on here to talk, and it's an inspiring and wonderful group of people. But I do also think that we are starting to see a larger shift and a much greater global awareness of these issues. And even if it's not necessarily always tied back specifically to sustainability, environmental, issues and movements within fashion, I think we've seen all around the world that everyone's awareness of climate change, their acceptance that it's a global crisis and needs to be our top priority, is a reality that we can finally move into. I think that, governments, in the US especially, there's been big changes and recognition and movement towards acknowledging that we are in a crisis. And I think that that does relate back to the work that we do in fashion and in textiles, and that there is an increased awareness around what we purchase makes a difference. There's a saying that I always really like, that every time you buy something, you're basically voting for it. And so every purchase is a vote. You're voting for an organization or a company to stay alive by purchasing its goods, or you're voting for an organic product or over a conventional product. And I think that there's slowly becoming that kind of awareness around what I choose to consume, what I choose to purchase really matters.
Absolutely. And I think the more transparency there is in how our clothes are made, then people are going to realize, oh, if I vote for this, I might be voting for forced labor and migrant workers, or I might be voting for a dependency on coal as an energy source for boilers and dyeing fabrics, or which is one of the big issues for the industry around climate change, climate crisis. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's the beauty of all this sort of newfound media attention on this space. Is it's even a deeper kind of wake up. How has this pandemic changed, where like 12 months ago we could have had the same conversation, but to me something feels more real than 12 months ago? Tell me your experience on that.
Well, I think it's a new reality. I think we have to acknowledge that, business is not going to be in the same place that it was at the beginning of this. And I think there's a real opportunity in that. We've obviously seen a dip in the market across the world when it comes to purchasing because of the pandemic. But I think that with that, there's an opportunity to rebuild and build back better, and it's certainly something that gets talked about more in a governmental context, but I think it's something that can be applied to any context. So we know, that we cannot address the climate crisis. We cannot address the issues that we're facing if we continue to grow and consume at the rate that we have. We can't. We do have to slow growth, and we have to remove prosperity and can absolutely over rampantly and overrun need for new from one another. So we can't continue to have and use materials at the rate we're using it at. We can't continue to dispose of things at the rate we dispose of things. All of that has to change. And I think that the moment that we're in history is the opportunity to pause and look at how we want to build back these systems and capture markets in a new way, in a way that is embracing new business models, looking at rental, looking at resale. I know that you talked to Christy recently, and I think that she's obviously a huge pioneer in that space. But in general, I think there's an opening here that we can take. And I also would like to think, and this might be too optimistic, that the pandemic has taught us to listen to science and scientists because they know what they're talking about. And when we don't, we end up in rough situations. And I think that if we can apply that logic to the environmental crisis and the topics that you and I, focus on, that would be a great learning to come out of this with.
It's very really interesting, because I think a lot of people have referred to this pandemic as sort of the dress rehearsal for the climate crisis, and what they mean by that, I think, is that this pandemic can accelerate disaster in a matter of hours, days, weeks. That you can see the impact of a non-science-based behavioral thinking or non-intervention, and so the climate crisis, climate change crisis, is really across it feels like a longer time period, right? Like if I go out and burn a bunch of coal right now, in some manufacturing process, it's not going to destroy us all today, tomorrow, or the next week. But it's in this whole process of this slow temperature rise. And so I think that's where people kind of feel like you can sort of hide behind the lack of immediacy, urgency. But meanwhile, the science community has been telling us, not just for a year or two, but probably for the last 40 years, like this is urgent, this is so urgent. And then Al Gore came in the 2000s and with Inconvenient Truth, this is urgent. And I think we have these peak periods where we listen again and take it seriously and dive in. And so I don't know. I'm just curious to know if you think that this is if the pandemic has been a dress rehearsal for a lot, and therefore it's like a magnifying glass on where we should start leaning in faster.
I think that we saw a lot happen in the last year in general. There's been a lot of social movements. There's been a lot of kind of, I'd say, social awareness raising that was very necessary and needed to happen. And I think that it is a dress rehearsal, but it's also, I think it gave us a moment to slow down and pay attention. Yeah. I think that, I certainly, in my previous job, I traveled a lot. I think we all travel a lot, or traveled Yes,
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, in jobs around the world, because it's such a global economy, we all travel a lot, no matter what we're doing.
Mhm.
And we all
Mhm.
slowed down. And I think it gives us a chance to pay attention and to listen to voices that sometimes don't get heard. And I think we did get to see that. And I think that we have to really hold on to that as we move into, going back to normal. I also
So,
think we really saw how much people want to go back to normal. And so we
yeah.
have to remind ourselves, like, what is normal and what matters, and let's not go back to exactly where we were when we started.
Absolutely. I've been hearing rumblings of a predicted roaring 20s and what that means for behavior and consumption and all that. And so that, in one way, people aren't going to go back and they're not going to be the same. And we're going to make choices, but there will be, as we've seen in these little mini wave pockets of people getting frustrated and then going out and sort of, not adhering to the behavior that we need. Well, so what you were just saying was really interesting to me, because I think you were saying it earlier too, when I sort of brought us into the climate conversation, which is this year has given us a moment to pause and then actually ask ourselves questions about values and
Yeah.
whether or not the things we engage in our lives, our behavior, like travel, constant travel, and that's not a bad, I mean, travel's not a bad thing, but what we're talking about is that for business, we were literally on the road all the time. And there was an oxymoron kind of to like, oh, aren't you trying to save the planet? And now you're jumping
Yeah.
on another airplane. I mean, I would get
Yeah.
people say that to me, and if they were,
Yeah.
you're like, so this opportunity to evaluate our behavior, evaluate what we relate to, whether it's our food in our home, our clothes in our closet, looking around the four walls of our home and saying, is this the way I like to live? Do I need to, change things up so I can have more space with my spouse or my kids? People are asking a lot of deeper values-based questions. And I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from you too, is there's this opportunity to really start looking at values related to this work. And Christy and I talked a little bit about that last week too. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It made me really look at what I wanted out of life. I mean, I changed jobs in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
So, I'm really happy to be where I'm working now. I mean, I loved my job at Stella. It's not to say that, but to be, working with a nonprofit for the first time, and, in a space I know you've been in for a while, but it's really rewarding to be able to be focused fully 100% on how we can help the world and the industry. And, I think that is that for me did kind of come from the slowing down to some degree, and what can I do personally, is that question. I think a lot of people ask themselves is, well, I see that there's a crisis here, how can I contribute? What can I be doing to help fix it?
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the work. And one of the things, so when you and I were working together, we were working on this materials library that was verified under material health and was going to build out the future of circular materials, and amazing. And we need that. And that is still those things are still being built. Some of them inside Fashion Positive, some of them just through critical certifications. Some of them, are just happening in different work streams. One of the things that I always really gained from working with you was your ability to look at a supply chain and a system and not just try to solve for the one issue that you were working on, whether it was chemistry or material health, but you were able to see the impacts that were happening in different angles of that supply chain, whether it was social and labor or deforestation or soil health, and I think that now you're in a position where you're really working even more deeply on helping the industry look at the impacts of the materials they use and then establish a better preferred materials approach. Can you talk a little bit about your passion for materials and supply chains and this work that you're doing now?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I really am maybe I'm obnoxiously passionate about supply chains and systems, but I mean, the work that Textile Exchange does, the work that I'll be doing with Textile Exchange, is really focused on fibers and materials. which is the part of the supply chain that I've always been really personally drawn to. I think that, when we look at a global supply chain, as you were saying, it's made up of a lot of different elements, and it takes a lot of different people wearing a lot of different hats to really address it all. There's a huge chemistry element. There's, you're talking about coal and some of the work that you're doing at AII around helping to phase out coal and look at how we improve water and energy. And I really respect all of that, but my passion really is about the materials, and that's for me where I've always been drawn. And so at Textile Exchange, we are very clear about that focus. The space and place that we're holding and focusing on is what we call tier 4, in industry jargon. And to explain that to people who aren't in our bubble, if we break the supply chain down into tiers, tier 0 would be what you would engage with, what we would engage with when we go into a store. It's, operations, it's stores, it's offices, it's the things that, a brand really directly controls. Tier 1 is manufacturing, where things are sewn and produced. Tier 2 is dyeing, weaving, mills, basically where the fabrics are put together. Tier 3 is where we convert materials. So, if we're talking about wool, it's where you clean wool. Tier 4 is where the materials are actually created. So that's the farms, that's the fields, that's the forest, that's the recycling plants, that's really where things are being generated and created. And that's the part that I'm very passionate about, and I think has incredible potential to make a meaningful dent in the problems that we're addressing. Agriculture is going to be one of the things that makes or breaks us when it comes to biodiversity loss, when it comes to climate change. And while we don't really think of fashion always being made up as agricultural systems, it is. We grow cotton, sheep, wool, we've got leather, we've got a lot of different agricultural systems within the fashion supply chain. And that's the part that we're really looking at Textile Exchange, is how to transform that part of the supply chain. How to take a conventional cotton farm and turn it into an organic cotton farm, how to help a sheep herder, sheep rancher, farmer in, South America use regenerative grazing practices. And there's so much potential and so much opportunity there. And I also think, just from, the kind of customer, the you and I, the people, all of us who wear clothing, I also think that part of what draws me to that is that the material part of a garment is the part of the garment you can understand. It's really not very tangible to talk about chemistry or coal when you're talking about, a jean jacket, a denim jacket. But what you can talk about is you can talk about dye, you can talk about color, but primarily you're going to be touching the material. You're feeling the material. I think that's the most direct tie that we have as people that wear clothing to the clothing is the material. And so I also think that outside of the kind of the nitty gritty, the more scientific need to address the systems and the opportunities that are within those systems to stop deforestation, to regenerate croplands and, rebuild soil health. I also think there's a huge opportunity to engage with the end person, the end customer, the you and the me and the everybody, all of us that wear clothing, because materials can tell really powerful stories. And fashion has an incredible opportunity and space to capture the imagination and tell those stories.
As you mentioned, denim jacket, and I looked at mine and I thought, this in particular was made by Arvind Mills in India for Levi's, and it was hand loomed denim. That means it was actually in someone's home using a hand loom, not a electrical driven machine, and it has the name of the person who loomed it and here. And this is independent of the fashion revolution movement around who made my clothes. This is something that they did. Do you think this is the future, like something like this, where there's a distributed supply chain of production as well, but that we actually get more information? And sometimes we get that. Sometimes that's sort of a marketing gimmick, but that kind of transparency and traceability of knowing where the farm was, knowing if you care that you could dive in and find out more information, because through digital platforms and data collection, we can dive in and know, what are the regenerative soil practices of the farm where this was made. Is that our future?
I think it's a version of our future. I think there's a couple things within that. So I think that us, me, everyone, we're all really focused on transparency and traceability. And I do think it's a critical part of this. But I think that it's important to remember that traceability and transparency is probably most relevant when we're tracing it back to good practices. And so I think that, we don't want to be so focused on like scoring and solution tech and, blockchain and the rest of the things that really will help us if we're not as equally focused on making those changes
100%.
at the supply chain. Because I think that sometimes we talk about transparency and traceability as the thing that's going to solve it. And it's definitely not the thing that's going to solve it. It may help, but it's actually what do people along the supply chain need to make those changes? How do we incentivize a farmer to switch to organic? How do we incentivize recycling companies to actually start looking at textile to textile recycling? What is our role as an NGO? What is, your role as an individual purchasing something? What do we need our government to actually do to make this happen? These are the big questions. And I do think the kind of visibility into the supply chain is going to be a critical enabler, but it's definitely not the end all be all. And I think that to me has become, something that we always need to kind of keep an eye on, because we do get really excited about this idea of like being able to see the farm, but nobody wants to see the farm unless the farm is excellent,
Exactly. I'm kind of laughing, remembering that episode of Portlandia where they go to dinner to order chicken, and then they have the whole like roster of where the chicken earned its French degree or where it studied Latin.
Yeah.
Would you like to go to the farm and see it? And I think that there's a real parallel. You mentioned this is an agricultural industry, and there's a real parallel to food ag, and so a lot of the solutions and work that's happening. I was on a podcast yesterday about fiber sheds that you know about, that was related to food and agriculture. And it's like looking at the parallel between these, because there is a lot of parallel. And I think we can take some lessons from that industry who's actually been able to storytell and engage the consumer with understanding more about the farm and making the farm interesting again. And then you start caring about the people making the food, and in this case, making the clothes. So I do think, what we're talking about is you can't stop doing the impact work. You can't actually stop fixing the problem just to build a system to be telling the story. You have to dual track these two things, right? Which is why I love the work we do at AI. I mean, we're project managing these mill improvement programs week over week, month over month, and so it's measurable progress. And I think that's what you and I are sort of drawn to too, is like the real roll up our sleeves and let's report the impact of what we just did.
Yeah. Cool. And I think, one of the really interesting things about now being at Textile Exchange for me is I've always really appreciated as a person in a brand, standards and certifications, but I have to say, like, I've kind of come to have a whole new appreciation of them, being a part of an organization that's creating, the standards and helping manage certifications, because I think that that's a really important lever. And I think as a brand, I kind of took it for granted that they existed, I guess. We could buy certified materials if we wanted them. But I think that, when we talk about that storytelling, and I think talking about food, that verification element from the material to the finished product is really powerful. And maybe we've even underutilized it, I'm realizing, because, that's again, like, that's a verified impact. It's not saying the whole supply chain's fixed, but it is saying, this is a responsible wool. This was created, farmed, raw material, not the whole supply chain, but with animal welfare, with the correct type of grazing practices, and I think that starts to get like, I think it can be a very powerful thing back to a customer, and a very exciting kind of underutilized part of our industry, maybe.
I'm with you too. I'd love to have a whole other podcast conversation where we just talk about certification verification, because this week in particular, I've been talking about that, because I do think that, and you're a systems thinker, you're a systems change, systems theory thinker, and it's really about how can you leverage that also to create the widest sort of shift, or the biggest lever you can pull. And it's about education, information. It's about literally creating the standard way and then holding people accountable to it. And then having a way to say, oh, and by the way, they're telling the truth. So, which is also much necessary. Where, certifications can get challenging sometimes is when they become businesses, they get too expensive, they're not operationalized. So anyway, we'll save this for another day, but we have to operationalize all this work. It has to be, it can't be sitting here as this small thing. And I think that's one of the things I've learned over the last decade is, how do you scale these solutions, whether it's a standard, whether it's a mill improvement intervention, whether it's a new technology, scalability and removing those barriers is the key to all this, I think. Unless you just do it because you're learning, and you and I've talked about that too, right? Like, we're doing it because we're going to learn a lot, but we would never be able to scale it.
No. But we also have to stop pretending like sustainable materials cost the same as materials that are ruining the planet, because they don't. Like, it's cheaper to ruin the planet, unfortunately. And so while I agree we can't have it cost so much that it's prohibitive, like, we also have to be realistic that the way that certain models have been set up and certain kind of margin systems have been set up, we're not going to be able to exist within that and scale these materials. Like a living wage being paid to a farmer, synthetic fertilizers that aren't going to destroy our soil, those things are going to cost more to start, at least, when we're scaling. And so one of the things that Lorraine, who's the CEO of Textile Exchange, talks about a lot is how do we unlock that price to value paradigm? How do we move away from being price obsessed to understanding the value of these decisions? And I think that, we're talking about that a little bit at the beginning around like, how do we slow growth? And that's going to have to be part of it, is we shift away from only cost and price to understanding value. What is the cost of not doing this? What is the value of doing it? And that kind of, it's going to be a big shift, but I think we have to do it.
So you bring up an interesting question and point, and I want to ask this, and then I want to get into some personal stuff. If you're up for it, so the problem with this sort of faster machine, I don't like demonize companies and say fast fashion. I mean, yes, we can, but it's more about there's a fast machine. We can all admit that. And there's good and bad players. And there's also some who are doing some really great good things, like leadership things, and they're still cranking out the fast machine. The problem is if you raise your price and you bring everything to somebody new is going to emerge below you and go, well, we're happy to be the $4 t-shirt guys that push forced labor and that use toxic chemicals. Like, so it's kind of hard because you would open up a market for a worse competitor to come in, which makes me think it gets back to policy and regulation. And I'm just curious to know, at the end of the day, yes, we can let capitalism and we can lean into sort of purpose-driven corporate thinking and value systems and ESG reporting and all that. But if we don't create some level of baseline policy around a lot of the use of chemicals, coal, renewable energy, labor practices, I mean, what is your thinking on that?
I completely agree. Actually, and this will be a nice dovetail into my personal history, because I was actually talking to someone about this last week, and before I did even before the last job, my very first career was in the film industry, and I was a costume designer, and that's what I did for almost 4 years in Los Angeles. And in the time that I was living in Los Angeles, was when the kind of shift was happening where film started being made less in LA, more in Atlanta, more in Louisiana. And that wasn't because all of a sudden the film industry that I'd like to make films in Atlanta and Louisiana. It's because there were tax incentives to make films in Atlanta and Louisiana. And so an industry that had been primarily based in one city for a very long time shifted its business almost overnight to being made. Films have been being made in Canada for quite a while, but being made in places like Louisiana, and Atlanta became a huge hub as well because Georgia
was living there. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I rented out my condo for a movie. I mean, there were movies every week happening on your street. It was crazy.
It happened in months, not years, months. It was overnight, and that is the power of government support. It can disrupt, and creating those correct market conditions for change is critical, and the government plays an imperative role in doing that. So if there was a tax break for organic cotton, recycled polyester, coal-free, that companies would go there. It would shift the market so quickly, because if there's a financial incentive, it is the easiest way to shift the market. Absolutely. And so I do think that policy is going to play a critical role in this. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. It's not a theory. It works. If you provide a tax incentive, a tax break, anything, along those lines, or regulation, I think that's the quickest way to do it. And I think we get too caught up on regulations. I think we should be focused on supporting good. And, if we can create those market conditions for good to flourish, I actually think that's going to be the quickest way to move things personally.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's a whole other podcast. We're going to have 10
Yeah.
conversations like this. And the good news is we can have them offline too, but I want people to hear
Yes.
this. So, okay,
Yeah.
personal questions.
Yeah.
Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? And, this is a lot of looming issues. Yeah.
I am. No, I really am though.
Yeah.
Like, Christina Figueres, who is amazing, an amazing woman, really talks about this idea of how important optimism is in addressing this topic, and that to be an optimist requires grit. It's not. Oh, we've got a weird echo. Okay.
I'm back. I'm back.
Okay.
The phone rang. Sorry.
That optimism is sometimes seen as kind of, being naive, but to be optimistic is not naive. Optimism requires courage and it requires grit. And I think that I really believe that. And I think that, pulling your, comforter up over your head and saying, I can't handle it isn't going to get us anywhere. And so I would say that I am pragmatically optimistic. I'm not giving up, but I feel like there's a real fire under me because 10 years is not a long time. You started by saying we can't feel these things right away, and we can't, but we are feeling them for the first time in a very real way. And we're going to start feeling them more and more every year. And I'm optimistic, but I'm also a little bit afraid is what I would say. I'm a little bit freaked out.
Yeah. I get it. And I take back a little bit what I've said, because you're right. This year too, with all that was happening here in California with the fires and all, we saw something different. We definitely saw something different. So we're seeing it. Okay. Last question. And I know we're at our time. Last question is, first of all, you inspire me as my friend, as somebody I learn from, somebody who asks tough questions. Who does this for you? Who inspires you? Who brings you sort of the energy that you get excited about, who you learn from?
I mean, it's a really long list. You're definitely on that list, first of all. But I mean, so I've just, as you know, I've just joined Textile Exchange. Lorraine, who's our CEO, really inspires me. I think what she's built at Textile Exchange is incredibly inspiring. Starting as a farmer and creating a global nonprofit, and that's working with pretty much every fashion brand you've ever heard of. We have over 500 members. I find that incredibly inspiring. A lot of, I think, the people that you'll have on here, the Julie Gilharts of the world, Linda Greer is a real inspiration. I moved here to London to do my master's. Dilys Williams, who runs the Center for Sustainable Fashion, is a real mentor. And I mean, I'm going to forget people if I start naming them. It's going to get worse.
It's not the Academy Awards.
Everybody, no. But I just think I'm inspired by our community, and I'm inspired by the fact that our community is also full, and this is no offense to you, but of a lot of really incredible women. And
I think my podcast is going to be dominated by really amazing women, and I'm really cool with that. Yeah. Nice.
So thanks. Everybody. No, but it's really it's a great community, and feel lucky to be a part of it. Feel lucky to know you, Lewis.
I feel the same way. I mean, you give me, I think it's like you lean into the people in your life that bring you energy and bring you alive, and you're one of those people for me. So thank you for this half hour plus that you've spent with us today. You're amazing. I'll see you on a Zoom call in the next couple of days, I'm sure. We're probably on several together. All right. See you later. Thanks, Claire. Bye.